4:30 in the morning, 0 degrees. A 61-year-old widow flips on the lights of an empty highway diner and starts the coffee, the way she has for 28 years. She doesn't know it's her last shift. She doesn't know a man in leather shoes has already decided she's worth nothing. Just a truck stop waitress, he laughed, not exactly hard to replace. She doesn't know she's about to lose her house, her job, everything. And she has no idea that 100 miles east, a driver she once saved is gripping a radio, about to make one phone call that will send 200 trucks roaring toward her door. She heard what they said. So did they. At 4:37 in the morning, the wind off the Nebraska plains hit the windows of the Prairie Rose Diner like it had a grudge, and Ruth Merritt didn't even look up. She had learned the sound of that wind the way other people learn a song. It came in low across the flat frozen fields outside Ogallala, gathered speed over the parking lot where the big rigs sat idling in long silver rows, and slammed into the glass with a rattle that would have startled a stranger. Ruth just tightened the belt of her apron and slid another pot of coffee onto the warmer. She was 61 years old, and she had worked this counter for 28 of those years. Her hands knew the work better than her mind did. She could pour a cup without spilling while looking a man in the eye, could carry 4 plates up one arm, could tell from the way a driver dropped onto a stool whether he wanted conversation or silence. Mostly they wanted silence at this hour, and she gave it to them like a gift. The diner sat just off exit 126, a low brick building with a neon rose in the window that flickered pink against the dark. Out here on Interstate 80, in the long, empty stretch between Lincoln and the Colorado line, the Prairie Rose was a lighthouse. Truckers hauling freight across the country planned their nights around it. They knew that no matter the hour, the coffee would be hot and Ruth would be behind the counter. "Morning, Ruth." The door swung open and a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket stamped the snow off his boots. "Morning, Hank." She was already reaching for the mug he liked, the chipped blue one he'd claimed years ago. Sausage and eggs, over medium, wheat toast dry. Hank Dawson grinned and lowered himself onto a stool. "You know, one of these days I'm going to order something different just to watch you faint." "You've been saying that since the Clinton administration," Ruth said, and Earl the cook laughed from the kitchen window. That was the thing about Ruth that people didn't understand until they'd sat at her counter a few times. She remembered them. Not just the orders. She remembered that Hank's granddaughter had been born premature and had pulled through. She remembered that Roy Whittaker, who used to come through hauling grain, had a bad knee and needed the booth by the door. She remembered the name of every driver's dog, every driver's route, every driver's heartbreak. In a life spent moving, these men and women had one fixed point on the whole map of the country, and it was a woman in a pink apron who looked genuinely glad to see them come through the door. Ruth topped off Hank's coffee and glanced up at the clock. In another hour, the sun would come up grey over the fields, and the morning rush of locals would replace the truckers, and she would go home to the small house on Spruce Street where her granddaughter was sleeping. She pushed that thought away. She had a habit of not thinking about home while she was here. Here was easier. The bell over the door jingled again, but this time the man who walked in was not a trucker. He wore a charcoal overcoat and leather shoes that were entirely wrong for a Nebraska January, and he moved through the diner like a man taking inventory. He looked at the cracked vinyl on the booths, at the yellowed photographs of drivers taped behind the register, at the hand-lettered sign that said, "If you're hungry and broke, tell Ruth." His mouth tightened at that one. "Can I get you a coffee?" Ruth asked, because she asked everyone. "No." He set a leather folder on the counter and produced a business card, sliding it toward her with 2 fingers. "Bradley Vance, Regional Director, Crossroads Hospitality Group. You're the manager here?" "I'm the waitress. Frank's the owner." Frank sold. Vance said it flatly, watching her face for the flinch. "6 weeks ago. My company acquired this location and 11 others along the corridor. I'm here to conduct an operational assessment before we begin the transition." Ruth felt something cold slide through her chest, but her hands kept moving, wiping the counter in slow circles. Frank didn't say anything. "Frank doesn't work here anymore. As of this morning, you report to me." Vance flipped open the folder and clicked a pen. His eyes went over her the way they'd gone over the cracked vinyl, an item to be evaluated, priced, and most likely replaced. How long have you been employed at this location? 28 years. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. 28 years, to a man like Bradley Vance, was not loyalty. It was overhead. It was a liability on a spreadsheet. An aging employee at the top of a pay scale that could be reset to zero with a fresh hire and a training video. "We'll be in touch," he said, and clicked the pen shut and walked out into the wind. Hank watched him go. Who in the world was that? Ruth looked down at the business card in her hand. Outside, the first grey light was creeping up over the frozen fields, and a truck pulled out of the lot with a hiss of air brakes, and the neon rose flickered once and held. "Trouble," she said quietly. "I think that was trouble." She didn't know yet how right she was, and she didn't know that the same wind rattling her windows was 100 miles east, blowing across the windshield of a blue Peterbilt, driven by a man named Daniel Prescott. A man who owed her a debt he had never found the words to repay. Daniel Prescott had been driving for 22 hours with a 4-hour nap in a rest area outside Des Moines, and he pulled into the Prairie Rose lot a little after 7 in the morning, with his eyes burning and his shoulders locked into the shape of the wheel. He didn't need to stop. He was making good time on a load of auto parts bound for Salt Lake. But he always stopped at the Prairie Rose. He had been stopping there for 12 years, and he could no more drive past it than he could drive past his own mother's grave. He sat in the cab for a minute before going in, the way he always did, letting the engine tick down. 12 years ago, he had sat in this same lot in a very different state of mind. His marriage had just collapsed, his savings had gone with it, and he had been drinking on the road, which was a thing that ended careers and ended lives. He had pulled in that night with a plan he'd never told anyone about. A dark and final plan, and he had come inside only because it was cold, and he wanted one last cup of coffee before he did the thing he meant to do. Ruth had taken one look at him and known. She hadn't said anything dramatic. She hadn't called anyone. She had just poured him a coffee, and then, when the diner emptied out around 2 in the morning, she had come around the counter and sat down on the stool beside him and talked to him until the sun came up. She talked about her husband, Walt, who had driven this same corridor and who had died on a sheet of black ice 40 miles west of here in the winter of 1998. She talked about how she had wanted to lie down and stop too, and how she hadn't, and why. She never once told Daniel what to do. She just sat with him in the worst hour of his life so that he was not alone in it, and somewhere in that long night the plan had let go of him like a hand opening. He had driven out of that lot alive. He had gotten sober. He had rebuilt, and in 12 years he had never told her what she'd done, because every time he tried, the words got stuck somewhere below his throat. He went inside. The diner was warm and smelled like bacon and coffee, and Ruth looked up and her whole face changed. "Daniel Prescott," she said. "You look half dead." "Feel it too." He dropped onto a stool. "Coffee, Ruth. Keep it coming." She poured it, and she set down a plate of eggs he hadn't ordered, and she said, "Eat that before you drive another mile. I mean it." And he ate it, because when Ruth Merritt told you to do something, you did it. He noticed the business card by the register while he was eating. He noticed something else too, a tightness around Ruth's eyes that hadn't been there before. She was still Ruth, still moving up and down the counter with a word for everyone, but underneath it she was carrying something. Daniel had spent a lot of years learning to read the weight people carried, because for a long time he'd carried too much of his own. He was about to ask her about it when the bell over the door jingled and Bradley Vance walked back in. He came in like he owned the place, which technically he now did, and he had 2 other men in suits with him, and he was talking loudly on his phone. He waved a hand at Ruth without looking at her. "Coffee. 3. And he kept talking. Ruth brought the coffee. Vance took his cup without a thank you and kept on with his call, and the men at the counter, Hank and a couple of other drivers, and Daniel, all felt the temperature in the room drop. There is a particular way that certain men treat waitresses and cashiers and the people who clean their hotel rooms, and every trucker at that counter had seen it 1,000 times, and every one of them hated it. "Yeah, the Ogallala site," Vance was saying into his phone, "it's a teardown, basically. Structure's fine, but the operation's a relic. We convert it to the automated model, kiosks, minimal staff. Yeah, well, there's a woman here been on payroll since forever, top of scale. We'll obviously..." He laughed at something the other person said and glanced at Ruth and lowered his voice not at all. I know. Look, she's just a truck stop waitress. She's not exactly hard to replace. We'll cut her loose with the transition and bring in kids at minimum wage. It's fine. The diner went very quiet. Ruth was standing 3 feet away with the coffee pot still in her hand, and she had heard every word, and so had every driver in the room. For a moment nobody moved. Ruth's face did not crumple. That was the thing Daniel would remember later, the thing that undid him. She did not cry, and she did not snap. She simply set the pot back on the warmer, smoothed her apron, and went back to wiping down the far end of the counter as if she had heard nothing at all. Because 28 years of dignity does not evaporate just because a man in leather shoes decides you are worth nothing. Vance finished his call, drank his coffee, dropped a 5 on the counter as if it were a tip and an insult at once, and left with his 2 suits trailing behind him. Hank was red in the face. Ruth, you don't have to take that. That was... It's fine, Hank. Her voice was steady. Eat your breakfast. But it was not fine. Daniel sat there with his cold eggs and his burning eyes and a fury building in him so slow and so total that it frightened him a little. He looked at the woman who had sat beside him 12 years ago in the darkest hour of his life. The woman who had never once made him feel like less than a man, even when he'd felt like nothing at all, and he watched her fold that man's cruelty up small and tuck it away where it wouldn't show, and he thought, no, not her, not this one. He didn't say any of that. He finished his coffee, and he left a 20 under his plate. And on his way out, he stopped and put his hand on Ruth's shoulder. You take care of yourself, he said. You too, sweetheart. Drive safe. He climbed back into the blue Peterbilt, but he did not pull out towards Salt Lake. He sat there in the cold cab, and he reached for the CB radio, and he keyed the mic, and he sat for a second, not knowing exactly what he was going to say. Then he started talking. The story came to Daniel in pieces over the next 2 days, and every piece was heavier than the last. He got the first piece from Donna Kessler, the daytime waitress, who cornered him by his truck when he came back through on Thursday. Donna had worked alongside Ruth for 9 years, and Donna was scared. They posted it, Donna said, hugging her cardigan against the wind. The transition notice. Diner closes in 2 weeks. They're gutting it, putting in those machines. Everybody's out. She looked back at the building. But it's worse than that, Daniel. It's a lot worse than that for Ruth. And then Donna told him the things Ruth never told anyone. Ruth had raised her son, Ethan, alone after Walt died on the ice. She'd put him through school on a waitress's wages and a widow's grief. And Ethan had grown up good and gotten married and had a little girl named Lily. 2 years ago, Ethan and his wife had been driving home from Lily's kindergarten Christmas program when a man who'd been drinking crossed the center line on Highway 61 and hit them head-on. Ethan and his wife were killed. Lily, strapped into her car seat in the back, survived without a scratch. Ruth took the child in without a second's hesitation. She was 59 years old, and she started over as a mother. But that wasn't all of it. Ethan had been sick before the crash, a long, expensive illness the year before, and he'd been between insurance, and the bills had followed him to the grave, and then followed Ruth. She could have walked away from her dead son's debt. Any lawyer would have told her to. Instead, she had quietly taken it on, all of it, because that was the kind of thing Ruth did, and she had been paying it down $40 at a time for 2 years, working doubles, driving the same rusted Buick she'd had since Ethan was in high school. She's behind on the house, Donna said, and her voice cracked. Way behind. The medical stuff and raising Lily, it ate everything. She got a letter last month. If she doesn't come up with the back payments by the end of the month, the bank takes the house on Spruce Street. And now they're firing her too. Donna wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. She hasn't told a soul. She'd die before she'd let one of you boys know she was hurting. She's spent 28 years taking care of all of you, and she'd rather lose everything than have anybody worry about her. Daniel stood in the cold and felt the whole shape of it settle onto him. Here was a woman who had lost her husband to this road and never blamed it, who had lost her son to a drunk driver and taken in his orphaned daughter without complaint, who had shouldered a debt that wasn't hers to carry out of nothing but love, who had sat beside a broken stranger in the middle of the night 12 years ago and talked him back into living. And the thanks she was getting from the world was a man in leather shoes calling her just a truck stop waitress and cutting her loose to lose her home 2 weeks before Christmas. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in his cab in a rest area west of North Platte, and he thought about all of it, and a cold voice in the back of his head kept telling him it was hopeless. What was he going to do? He was one driver. He had maybe $800 in savings and a truck that wasn't even paid off. The truckers who loved Ruth were scattered across 10,000 miles of interstate, strangers to each other, moving in every direction at once. There was no organization, there was no fund. There was just a lot of tired men and women in a lot of separate trucks who all happened to love the same woman and had no way to do anything about it. He almost talked himself out of it. That was the truth he'd admit later. Sitting in that dark cab, he almost decided it was too big, too scattered, too late. And then he thought about the sign taped behind Ruth's register, the one in her own handwriting. If you're hungry and broke, tell Ruth. He thought about how many drivers over the years had eaten free at that counter and never been made to feel it. He thought about the coffee she'd poured at 4 in the morning for men she knew couldn't tip her. He thought about a plan he'd once had in a parking lot and a woman who'd sat down beside him and refused to let him be alone. She had built something out here without ever knowing she was building it. 28 years of small kindnesses, poured out one cup at a time to thousands of drivers who all carried her with them down the road like a warm coal in a cold pocket. Maybe, Daniel thought, it was time to see if any of that came back. He picked up his phone. He didn't just get on the CB this time. The CB only reached a few miles. He opened the big drivers' groups, the ones with tens of thousands of members, the private forums, the state-by-state pages, all of it. And he started to type. He told them who Ruth was. He told them what she'd done, all of it, everything Donna had told him and everything he knew himself, though he left his own story out because it was too much to say in writing. He told them about Bradley Vance and the words, just a truck stop waitress. He told them the house was going, the job was going, the deadline was the last Friday of the month. And at the end he wrote, she spent 28 years taking care of us. She never once asked for anything back. I think we've got about 10 days to show her what the road remembers. Who's with me? He hit post, then he set the phone down and put his head back against the seat, and he told himself not to hope too hard. He was almost asleep when the phone lit up. A CB voice crackled through the cab from a driver somewhere close on the interstate, rough and wide awake. Say that again, driver. Which diner? Where's this at? Daniel sat up, grabbed the mic. Prairie Rose, he said, exit 126, Ogallala. There was a pause, and then the radio came alive. It moved faster than Daniel could have imagined, and it moved the way things move among truckers, mouth to mouth, mile to mile, channel to channel, a signal running down the whole nervous system of the American interstate. By the second day, the post had been shared 11,000 times. Drivers who had eaten at the Prairie Rose in 1999 wrote in from Oregon and Georgia and Maine. Drivers who had never once set foot in Nebraska wrote in too, because they all knew a Ruth. Every one of them knew a Ruth somewhere on their own route, and this was a chance to pay her back through this one. Roy Whittaker, the grain hauler with the bad knee, saw the post in a hospital waiting room in Kansas City and made a phone call that Daniel wouldn't understand the size of until later. A woman named Marla, who ran a dispatch company in Omaha, started a fund, and it crossed $10,000 in a single night. Then 20. Then it kept going. But it wasn't the money in the end that mattered most. It was the plan the drivers made together, passing it down the line, the last Friday of the month, Ruth's last shift. Whoever can be there, be there. Bring your rig. We roll in together. Daniel spent a week making calls he wasn't built for. He wasn't an organizer. He was a quiet man who drove alone. But he found he could not stop because every time he thought about quitting, he saw Ruth setting that coffee pot down and smoothing her apron and going back to work as if her heart hadn't just been stepped on. So he made the calls. He talked to Roy Whittaker for 2 hours one night and hung up shaking. He coordinated with drivers he'd never met, working out staging areas and timing so that 200 trucks wouldn't simply gridlock a small Nebraska town. 200. That was the number that kept climbing in the group. 200 drivers said they'd be there. Ruth knew none of it. She worked her shifts and drove home to Lily in the rusted Buick and lay awake doing math that never came out right. She had told no one. She had made her peace in the private way that strong people make peace with disaster. And she had decided that whatever happened, she would keep her dignity and she would keep Lily fed, and the rest was in hands larger than her own. On Thursday night, the night before her last shift, she sat at her kitchen table after Lily was asleep and let herself cry for exactly 10 minutes, timed on the stove clock, and then she washed her face and went to bed. The last Friday of the month came up grey and bitter cold, the sky the colour of an old nickel, the temperature down near zero with a wind that cut to the bone. Ruth got to the Prairie Rose at 4 in the morning for what she believed was the last shift of a 28-year career. She turned on the lights, she started the coffee, she flipped the sign to open and looked out at the empty lot, and she thought about Walt. And she got to work. The morning was strangely quiet, a few regulars, subdued. Donna was there, wound tight as a spring, checking her phone every 30 seconds, and Ruth assumed it was nerves about losing the job. Then, a little after 7, Ruth heard it. It started as a low sound under the wind, a rumble she felt in the floor before she heard it in the air. She thought it was thunder, which made no sense in a January this cold. It grew. It became the unmistakable sound of diesel engines, many of them, more than many, and air horns, and it was coming down the interstate toward exit 126, like a wave. Donna was crying and laughing at the same time. "Go look, Ruth. Go to the window and look." Ruth walked to the front window, dish towel still in her hand, and she looked out at the parking lot and the frontage road and the interstate beyond, and the dish towel slipped from her fingers. Trucks. Everywhere trucks. They came off the exit in a line that had no end, one after another, red and blue and chrome, hauling nothing but themselves, and they filled the lot, and then they filled the frontage road, and then they pulled onto the shoulder of I-80 in both directions as far as she could see, and every single one of them was leaning on the air horn, 200 air horns blowing at once in the cold grey morning until the sound was a physical thing you could feel in your chest. A wall of it, a roar. Drivers were climbing down from their cabs, dozens of them, men and women in Carhartts and flannel and ball caps, walking toward the Prairie Rose across the frozen lot. And some of them she knew, and most of them she had never seen in her life, and every one of them was looking at her through the window. Ruth put her hand over her mouth. The door opened, and the drivers began to come in, and at the front of them was Daniel Prescott, hat in his hands. "Ruth," he said, and his voice broke on her name. "We heard what they said about you." She couldn't speak. She was shaking her head, the way people do when a thing is too large to let inside. Behind Daniel, the drivers came in and set things on the counter. Coffee cans stuffed with cash, envelopes, a cigar box. One old driver set down a mason jar of crumpled bills and quarters and said, "That's from the truck stop in Laramie." We passed the hat. Roy Whittaker came through the door on his bad knee and set down a folder, and inside the folder was something Daniel had learned about only the night before. Roy Whittaker didn't just haul grain anymore, hadn't for years. He owned a regional logistics company worth more than anyone at that counter had ever guessed. And the folder held an offer to buy the Prairie Rose outright from Crossroads Hospitality, at a price they would not refuse, and to keep it open exactly as it was, with Ruth as its manager, for as long as she wanted the job. And that was the moment Bradley Vance's car pulled into the lot. He had come for the closing walkthrough. He got out of his car into a sea of 200 idling trucks and a wall of horn blast, and he stood there in his leather shoes and his charcoal overcoat, and for the first time since Ruth had met him, Bradley Vance had absolutely nothing to say. He looked at the trucks. He looked at the drivers streaming into the diner. He looked at the woman he had called just a truck stop waitress standing behind her counter with both hands over her face, and 200 people who had driven through the night from a dozen states to stand between her and him. Ruth lowered her hands. She looked out at all of them, and she looked at Daniel. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you all—" "Because you never once asked us to," Daniel said. "That's exactly why." They stayed all day. The Prairie Rose had never in its history held so many people, and it couldn't hold them, so most of the drivers rotated through in shifts, coming in to hug Ruth or shake her hand, or just look at her and say a few clumsy words before heading back out to make room for the next. The ones outside built fires in barrels and drank coffee in the cold and told each other Ruth stories. And there were more Ruth stories than anyone could have counted. The free meals, the remembered birthdays, the night she drove a sick driver 40 miles to the hospital in her own Buick, the Christmas she'd bought presents for a driver's kids because the man was too proud to say he was broke. Inside, Donna and Earl counted the money at the back booth, and Donna kept having to stop because her hands were shaking. When they finally reached a total, Donna wrote it on an order pad and slid it across the table to Ruth without a word. Ruth looked at the number. It was enough to pay the back payments on the house on Spruce Street. It was enough to clear the last of Ethan's debt, the debt she'd been carrying alone for 2 years. It was enough, with what was left over, to put something away for Lily. And that was before Roy Whittaker's folder, which meant the diner itself was saved, which meant the job was saved, which meant that in a single grey morning, every wall that had been closing in on Ruth Merritt had simply been picked up and carried off by 200 people she had spent her life quietly loving. She set the order pad down. She could not stop crying now, and she had stopped trying to. Bradley Vance had left within the hour, of course. There had been no scene, no shouting. Roy Whittaker had simply walked out to the man's car and had a short, private conversation. And by that afternoon, Crossroads Hospitality had accepted the offer, and Vance had driven east and out of the story. And the truth about men like Vance is that the world does not usually punish them with anything as satisfying as a comeuppance. It simply, occasionally, refuses to let them win. That was punishment enough. He had been so certain that a woman was worth nothing that he had never once thought to wonder what she was worth to anyone else. Late in the afternoon, when the crowd had thinned and the light was going long and gold across the snow, Ruth found Daniel alone at the end of the counter, nursing a cold coffee. She sat down on the stool beside him, the same way she had sat down beside him 12 years before, though he didn't yet know she remembered. "You did this," she said. "Donna told me. You started it." "I just made a phone call, Ruth. Everybody else did the rest." "Daniel." She put her hand over his. "Why you, out of all of them? Why did you take this on like it was your own life?" And Daniel Prescott, who had never in 12 years been able to get the words past his throat, found that he finally could. "Because 12 years ago I pulled into this lot and I wasn't planning to pull out of it," he said quietly. "I had it all figured out. And you sat down right here, right where you're sitting now, and you talked to me till the sun came up. And you never asked me a single question, and you never told me what to do. You just wouldn't let me be alone in it." His voice was rough. "I've owed you my whole life since that night, Ruth. Every mile I've driven for 12 years, I drove because of you. I never knew how to say it. So when that man called you just a waitress," he shook his head. "You're the reason I'm alive. There's a couple hundred drivers out there who've all got some version of that story. You just never bothered to keep score." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the trucks still standing in the fading light and at the drivers gathered around the barrel fires, and she understood something she had never let herself understand before, that all the kindness she had poured out into the world across 28 years, one cup of coffee at a time, believing it small and believing it forgotten, had never actually gone away at all. It had been out there the whole time, traveling the country in 1,000 cabs, waiting. "I always thought I was just doing my job," she said. "No, Mom," Daniel said. "You were doing a lot more than that. We just never got the chance to tell you." They sat there together for a while as the diner settled into evening and other drivers drifted over to say their goodbyes, and each of them had a story, and each of them left a little of it with her. An old man from Wyoming told her she'd fed his boy for a whole winter in 2004 and never once mentioned the tab. A young woman she'd never met said her father had driven this route until he passed, and that he used to talk about the waitress at the Prairie Rose who remembered his name, and that coming here today felt like getting to thank him too. One by one they came, and Ruth understood that she was not only being repaid for her own kindness, she was standing in a long chain of it, one that ran back through Walt and forward through Lily and out across the whole dark country, and that she had been a link in it without ever knowing. She had thought her life was small and unwitnessed. She had been wrong about that, completely, for 28 years. That evening, before the drivers finally scattered back out onto the interstate toward the loads and lives that were waiting for them, they did one last thing. They fixed a small brass plate above the door of the Prairie Rose And on it, Daniel had had 4 words engraved, the same 4 words that had hung in Ruth's own handwriting behind the register for as long as anyone could remember, now made permanent in metal, so that every driver who ever came through exit 126 would see them and understand what kind of place they'd walked into. If you're hungry and broke, tell Ruth. Ruth Merritt kept working the counter at the Prairie Rose for many years after that, though now she owned a piece of it. And now she went home a little earlier, and now Lily did her homework in the corner booth after school with a hot chocolate that Earl made without being asked. The neon rose still flickered pink in the window against the Nebraska dark. The wind still hit the glass like it had a grudge. And the trucks still came all night, every night, planning their long journeys around the one fixed and lighted point in all that empty country. The woman in the pink apron who had never once believed she was anything special, and who had been proven wrong on one grey morning by 200 people and the road that never forgot her name. Nobody, she learned, is ever just anything. The kindness you give away when no one is watching does not disappear. It goes out into the world, and it travels farther than you will ever know. And one cold morning, when you least expect it and need it most, it all comes home at once.